For decades, the automotive industry has followed one simple belief. If you wanted people to buy a new car, you gave them more. More horsepower, more technology, more comfort, more screens, more luxury. Year after year, every new model promised to be bigger, smarter, and more advanced than the last. Success seemed to follow a predictable formula. Add another feature, increase performance, raise the price, convince customers that more automatically meant better. Then something unusual appeared, a tiny concept car called the Dacia Hipster. It wasn't powerful, it wasn't luxurious, it wasn't loaded with cutting-edge technology. Compared to most modern vehicles, it looked almost unfinished. At first glance, it seemed like a step backward. If someone showed you this car without any explanation, the obvious conclusion would probably be the same. It's simply a cheap car. After all, the world has changed. Housing has become more expensive. Fuel costs continue to rise. Insurance premiums keep climbing. Daily life feels more expensive than ever. So maybe people are no longer dreaming about expensive vehicles. Maybe they simply want something affordable. That sounds like the perfect explanation. Until one problem appears. The market is already full of inexpensive cars. Many of them cost less than premium models. Yet almost none of them created the kind of discussion that surrounded the hipster. Clearly, something else was happening. Perhaps the answer isn't the price. Perhaps it's the design. Minimalism has become fashionable. Clean lines, simple shapes, less visual clutter. Maybe people simply appreciated a different aesthetic. Again, that sounds reasonable, but it doesn't completely fit either. Every year, manufacturers unveil beautiful concept cars. Some are futuristic, some are nostalgic, some win international design awards. Most disappear from public conversation within weeks. The hipster didn't. People weren't just talking about how it looked. They were asking why it felt strangely right. That's why this isn't really an investigation into a concept car. It's an investigation into a much bigger question. Why would millions of people suddenly become interested in a vehicle that deliberately offers less instead of more? Because maybe the hipster isn't important for what it is. Maybe it's important for what it reveals. And if this tiny concept car is only the symptom, then what is the real change hiding underneath? That question takes us to the first contradiction. The first surprising thing wasn't the car itself, it was the reaction. When journalists, designers, and everyday drivers first discussed the hipster, very few people started with horsepower. Almost nobody asked about top speed. Acceleration barely entered the conversation. Instead, one idea kept appearing over and over again. People described the car as refreshing, not exciting, not luxurious. Refreshing. That single word is surprisingly important, because cars usually attract attention by offering something new. This one attracted attention by taking things away. The obvious explanation is that people simply liked the design. Minimalist products have become popular in many industries. Phones became cleaner, furniture became simpler, architecture embraced open spaces, so perhaps the hipster was simply following the same trend. But that explanation quickly begins to fall apart. If minimal styling alone were enough, dozens of other concept cars should have created exactly the same reaction. They didn't. Which suggests that people weren't responding to the shape of the car. They were responding to the idea behind it. Look closer, and another pattern begins to emerge. Nearly every design decision follows the same philosophy. Less weight, less complexity, less equipment, less visual noise. Nothing appears to be missing by accident. Everything seems intentionally removed. Instead of asking, what else can we add? The hipster quietly asks a completely different question. What can we remove without making life worse? That may sound like a small difference. In reality, it changes the entire philosophy of building a car. And that creates the biggest contradiction of all. For decades, the global automotive industry competed by adding more power, more technology, more luxury, more features. The Dacia hipster moves in exactly the opposite direction. not because it couldn't become more complicated, but because it deliberately chose not to. So perhaps the real mystery isn't why this little concept car exists. Perhaps the real mystery is why the rest of the industry has spent decades moving the other way. And to answer that question, we first need to understand why modern cars never stopped becoming bigger, heavier, and more complicated in the first place. To understand why the hipster feels so unusual, we first have to understand the direction the entire automotive industry has taken over the past 30 years. Look at almost any showroom today, and one pattern immediately stands out. Cars have grown larger, heavier, more powerful, more expensive. Even compact cars now carry digital dashboards, large touchscreens, advanced driver assistance systems, multiple driving modes, premium sound systems, panoramic roofs, and countless electronic features that would have seemed extraordinary only 20 years ago. At first glance, this looks like progress. Every new generation appears to offer customers more value than the previous one. But was this really what customers were asking for? The obvious answer would be yes. People enjoy comfort. Families appreciate additional safety. Drivers like modern technology, navigation systems, adaptive cruise control, parking cameras, and smartphone connectivity genuinely make everyday driving easier. Manufacturers often present these features as direct responses to customer demand, and there is certainly some truth in that. Technology has improved. Safety standards have become stricter. Consumers have come to expect conveniences that once belonged only to luxury cars. But the deeper we investigate, the more complicated the picture becomes. Because customer demand is only one piece of the story, every additional feature also creates something else. Higher prices, higher profit margins, more opportunities to separate one model from another. When almost every engine delivers enough power for daily driving, manufacturers need new ways to convince buyers to upgrade. A larger screen, more software, another package, another subscription, another premium option. Gradually, competition shifted away from asking what people actually needed and toward asking what could be added next. Without anyone really noticing, more stopped being a benefit. It became the industry's default strategy. A car was no longer expected to solve transportation, it was expected to impress. That explains why the hipster feels so strange. It doesn't compete by offering one more feature than its rivals. It competes by questioning whether those features should exist at all. Instead of asking how much more can be added, it quietly asks how much complexity can be removed without sacrificing everyday usefulness. That isn't simply a different design choice, it's a completely different philosophy. And that raises another question. If every manufacturer believes success came from adding more, why did Dacia begin designing a car by taking things away? Most cars begin with a familiar question. What kind of vehicle do we want to build? Designers imagine the shape. Engineers develop the technology. Marketing teams decide which features customers might find attractive. Only after the product is nearly complete does pricing become the next challenge. The hipster appears to reverse that entire process. Instead of beginning with unlimited possibilities, it begins with limitations. How simple can a modern car become while still meeting the needs of everyday life? That single question changes everything. Once affordability becomes the starting point instead of the final adjustment, every decision begins to look different. Every kilogram matters. Every unnecessary component is questioned. Every design element must justify its existence. Removing something is no longer viewed as making the car worse. Sometimes removing complexity actually improves the experience. A lighter vehicle is easier to maneuver. Fewer electronic systems mean fewer things that can eventually fail. Simple interiors often reduce distraction instead of creating it. The goal is no longer to impress people during a 5-minute showroom visit. The goal is to make ownership easier for years. That is why describing the hipster as merely a cheap car completely misses the point. Cheap products usually feel like compromises. This concept does not. Its simplicity appears intentional rather than forced. Nothing suggests that designers wanted more but simply couldn't afford it. Instead, every decision communicates restraint. The philosophy is remarkably consistent. Only include what genuinely improves daily life. Leave everything else behind. In many ways, that approach feels less like cost-cutting and more like editing. Just as a good writer removes unnecessary words, the hipster removes unnecessary features. And suddenly, the car starts to resemble something much larger than a transportation project. It becomes a statement about priorities. Not every innovation has to involve adding something new. Sometimes innovation means discovering what can safely disappear. But if this philosophy feels surprisingly modern, history suggests it isn't modern at all, because long before the hipster appeared, the automotive world had already experienced moments when less became far more valuable than more. That takes us to the next chapter of the investigation. If the hipster's philosophy feels revolutionary, history tells a different story. This isn't the first time the automotive world has embraced simplicity. In fact, some of the most influential cars ever built followed exactly the same idea. They weren't created to impress people. They were created to solve real problems. The legendary Citroën 2CV was designed to carry farmers across rough countryside with minimal cost. The original Mini transformed urban transportation by making every centimeter count. The first Fiat Panda rejected unnecessary luxury in favor of practicality. Japanese K cars proved that extremely small vehicles could perfectly fit crowded cities. Different countries, different decades, different manufacturers, yet they all arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion. At first, it seems like these cars existed for only one reason: they were affordable. That explanation makes sense. Many appeared during periods of economic hardship, fuel shortages, or rapid urbanization. People simply couldn't afford large, expensive vehicles. So manufacturers responded by building smaller ones, case closed, or so it seems. Because affordability explains why people bought these cars, it doesn't fully explain why so many people continued loving them long after they no longer had to. Many of these vehicles eventually became cultural icons rather than temporary solutions. Clearly, something deeper was happening. Look closely at what these cars actually offered. Not luxury, not status, not overwhelming performance. They offered freedom, freedom to own a car without overwhelming financial pressure, freedom to park almost anywhere, freedom to drive through crowded cities with confidence, freedom from worrying about expensive repairs or complicated technology. Their greatest strength wasn't what they added, it was what they removed. They reduced ownership itself. Driving became simpler. Maintenance became simpler. Life became simpler, and perhaps that is the real pattern connecting them all. Whenever society becomes more complicated, simple cars begin to feel surprisingly attractive again. That realization changes how we see the hipster. Perhaps it isn't creating an entirely new movement. Perhaps it is simply the latest expression of an old cycle. History has repeatedly shown that people eventually grow tired of excess. When complexity reaches a certain point, simplicity starts looking like progress instead of compromise. If that's true, then the hipster didn't invent this philosophy. It simply arrived at exactly the moment people were ready to hear it again. But that raises another question. What changed in modern life that made millions of people begin searching for simplicity once more? To answer that question, we have to look beyond the automotive industry, because cars never exist in isolation. They reflect the world around them. Over the past 2 decades, daily life has quietly become more complicated. Housing costs have climbed. Insurance premiums continue to rise. Maintenance expenses have increased. Subscriptions fill our phones. Notifications compete for our attention every minute. Even simple decisions often require navigating endless choices. Without realizing it, many people have started carrying far more mental weight than previous generations. The obvious conclusion is that people simply want cheaper products, and certainly affordability matters. But if lower prices were the only goal, consumers would choose the absolute cheapest option every time. They don't. Many willingly pay more for products that reduce stress, save time, or simplify daily life. Minimalist homes became popular. Capsule wardrobes gained followers. Digital detoxes entered mainstream culture. People began removing things they once believed they needed. That suggests the shift isn't purely economic, it's psychological. The same change is beginning to appear in the automotive world. Drivers aren't only asking how fast a car can accelerate, they're asking how expensive it will be to maintain, how difficult it will be to repair, how much attention it demands every day. The definition of value has quietly changed. For decades, value meant getting more features for your money. Today, for many people, value increasingly means fewer burdens after the purchase. Ownership itself has become part of the product, and ownership has become exhausting. Seen from that perspective, the hipster suddenly makes much more sense. It isn't responding only to rising prices, it's responding to changing priorities. The car reflects a growing desire for clarity instead of complexity, for usefulness instead of excess, for enough instead of endless more. And perhaps that's the biggest discovery so far. The automotive industry didn't create this change. Society did. People changed first. Manufacturers are only beginning to notice. Which leads to one final question. If the hipster isn't really selling less car, then what is it actually selling? After following every clue, one conclusion becomes difficult to ignore. The Dacia hipster was never trying to compete with luxury cars. It wasn't trying to beat sports cars. It wasn't even trying to become the most technologically advanced vehicle on the road. It was solving an entirely different problem. Not transportation, not performance, but complexity. Almost every decision made during its design points toward the same objective. Remove what doesn't truly matter. Keep only what genuinely improves everyday life. When every part of the car follows the same philosophy, it stops feeling like cost-cutting. It starts feeling intentional. That changes the way we should think about the hipster. Most manufacturers sell features, larger displays, more driving modes, additional software, premium materials, more equipment than the previous generation. The hipster appears to sell something much harder to measure: peace of mind, lower ownership stress, less maintenance, less distraction, less financial pressure. In other words, it isn't asking buyers to admire the car. It's asking them to imagine a simpler relationship with owning one. And perhaps that is far more valuable than another touchscreen. This is why describing the hipster as a cheap car misses the entire story. Price is only one visible result of the philosophy. The philosophy itself is restraint. It accepts that adding another feature doesn't automatically improve life. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes every new layer creates another responsibility, another update, another repair, another subscription, another expense. By refusing unnecessary complexity, the hipster quietly challenges one of the biggest assumptions the automotive industry has promoted for decades. That progress always means adding more. Perhaps real progress sometimes begins by removing what no longer serves us, and that may be the hipster's greatest achievement. Not because millions of people will eventually buy one, not because it will transform the global car market overnight, but because it forces an uncomfortable question. What if the future of mobility isn't about building cars that can do everything? What if it's about building cars that do exactly enough? Once that question enters the conversation, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because suddenly, the smallest concept car on the stage begins asking the biggest question facing the entire industry. At the beginning of this investigation, the hipster looked like an exception. A tiny concept car that seemed completely out of place in a world obsessed with larger screens, more technology, and increasingly expensive vehicles. The obvious assumption was that it represented a clever marketing idea or another attempt to build an affordable car. But every chapter has pointed somewhere else. The hipster matters not because of what it is. It matters because of what it reveals. The real story was never hidden inside the car. It was hidden inside us. Long before this concept appeared, millions of people had already begun questioning the idea that more always leads to a better life. They simplified their homes, reduced unnecessary possessions, looked for products that demanded less attention instead of more. Cars were simply slower to follow that change. The hipster didn't create the movement. It arrived after the movement had already begun. Throughout automotive history, the industry has often acted like a mirror. Large family cars reflected expanding suburbs. Powerful muscle cars reflected an era of optimism and cheap fuel. Luxury SUVs reflected decades of rising consumption. Perhaps minimalist cars now reflect something entirely different. Not economic decline, not technological failure, but a growing desire to escape unnecessary complexity. If society has changed, then eventually the products built for that society must change as well. So perhaps the most important question isn't whether the Dacia hipster will ever reach production. Perhaps the more interesting question is whether it has already succeeded. Because sometimes concept cars don't exist to predict the future. They exist to reveal the present. The hipster reminds us that innovation doesn't always arrive by adding another feature, another screen, or another layer of technology. Sometimes innovation begins with a far simpler question. What if we've already added enough? And if millions of people are beginning to ask that same question, then this little concept car may not represent the future of Dacia alone. It may represent the future of how we think about cars themselves.